Drag her out." The judge's voice cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. The gavel slammed. Every head turned toward me. The bailiff took a step forward. Across the room my father smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an uncertain smile. A victorious one. The kind of smile a man wears when he believes he has finally won after spending 30 years trying. I sat perfectly still. The courtroom in Billings, Montana had gone quiet enough for me to hear the old ceiling fan turning above us. The bailiff reached for my arm. I looked past him and directly at the judge. "Does the name Raven-12 mean anything to you?" The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed. For a moment nobody moved. Not the bailiff, not my father, not even the court reporter. The judge stared at me as if he'd seen a ghost. Oh my God. His voice was barely a whisper. "You are..." A sudden crash echoed through the room. My father had collapsed. My name is Sarah Whitaker. I was 58 years old that day, and for the first time in my life my father was afraid. But to understand how we got there, you have to understand the kind of man Frank Whitaker was. To the town of Red Creek, Montana, my father was a respected citizen. Successful rancher, church deacon, Little League sponsor, Veterans Day parade organizer. The kind of man people described as solid. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered birthdays. The kind of man who could charm a room in 5 minutes. People loved him. I used to wish I could. Growing up, I spent years trying. Nothing worked. My younger brother Tommy was everything my father wanted. Athletic, outgoing, interested in ranching. Tommy could make one decent tackle during a football game, and Dad would talk about it for weeks. I got straight A's. Dad barely noticed. Tommy bought his first pickup. Dad framed the photo. I earned a scholarship. Dad asked if I was finally done showing off. Those things stay with a child. Even when that child becomes an adult. Even when that adult spends decades pretending otherwise. My mother Evelyn was different. She saw everything. She never challenged Dad directly. Back then, most women in our community didn't. But she found quiet ways to let me know I mattered. A note in my lunchbox. A phone call after an exam. A hug when Dad wasn't looking. She was the bridge between us. When she died 6 years ago, the bridge disappeared. And whatever little relationship remained between my father and me disappeared with it. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years before the lawsuit arrived. At the time I was living in Norfolk, Virginia. My life was simple. I owned a small house. I volunteered at the local veterans center. I spent mornings walking near the water and afternoons reading. After years working for the Navy, quiet felt like a gift. Then the certified letter arrived. I remember standing at my kitchen counter opening it. At first I thought there had been a mistake. Then I read it again. And again. My father was suing me. Not just suing me. Trying to strip me of my ownership rights to the Whitaker Ranch. The ranch had been in our family for generations. When my mother died, I learned something that shocked everyone. She had left me a legal share. Not Tommy. Not Dad. Me. The decision had enraged my father. At the time I didn't fight. I simply held the deed and moved on. For years nothing happened. Then suddenly 6 years later, Dad decided he wanted everything. His lawyers claimed I had abandoned the property. Claimed I had no interest in maintaining it. Claimed I didn't deserve ownership. The lawsuit wasn't about land. I knew that immediately. The acreage was just an excuse. Dad wanted one final victory. One final chance to prove I didn't belong. When I arrived back in Montana, the old town looked exactly the same. The diner still served cinnamon rolls the size of dinner plates. The church bell still rang every Sunday morning. The mountains still stood silently against the horizon. Only I had changed. Age does that. You stop trying to win battles that don't matter. Unfortunately, this one did. Because it wasn't really about me. It was about my mother. The share she left behind was her final statement. Her final act of love. A way of saying, "You belong here too." I wasn't going to let my father erase that. The first day in court confirmed my suspicions. The judge and Dad greeted each other by first name. They laughed together before proceedings started. I watched from my seat. Dad didn't even try to hide it. He was comfortable, relaxed, certain. The entire hearing felt predetermined. Every objection from my attorney was dismissed. Every argument from Dad's side was accepted. Hour after hour. The outcome became obvious. Even the spectators seemed to know. By lunch recess, Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in decades. He actually winked at Tommy, like a man celebrating an early victory. That afternoon, things got worse. The judge ruled against nearly every motion we filed. Then he accused me of withholding information. Information that didn't exist. When my attorney protested, he threatened sanctions. I could see where it was heading. The final humiliation. Public removal from the courtroom. Exactly the kind of ending my father would enjoy. And then came the moment. The order. Drag her out. The bailiff stepped forward. My father smiled. I looked at the judge and asked a simple question. Does the name Raven-12 mean anything to you? Everything changed. The judge turned pale. The bailiff froze. My father's smile vanished. And as he collapsed onto the courtroom floor, one thought crossed my mind. For the first time in 30 years, Dad was finally about to learn who his daughter really was. The last thing my father saw before he hit the floor was the expression on the judge's face. I know because I saw it too. For 30 years, Frank Whitaker had believed he understood everything. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who was successful? Who was a disappointment? And most of all, who his daughter was. The moment I said the words Raven-12, that certainty shattered. The courtroom exploded into confusion. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone yelled for a medic. Tommy rushed toward our father. The bailiff abandoned me and moved to assist. But none of that was what caught my attention. I was watching Judge Harold Benson. His hands were trembling. Not slightly. Visibly. The same man who had spent all morning treating me like an inconvenience suddenly looked as though he'd seen something impossible. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he leaned forward. Clear the courtroom. Nobody moved. I said, clear the courtroom. This time everyone listened. The spectators filed out. The attorneys gathered their files. Even the court reporter looked confused. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty. My attorney, Susan Keller, turned toward me. What the hell just happened? I gave her a small smile. Good question. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure myself. I had expected recognition. I had not expected panic. Susan lowered her voice. Sarah, who is Raven-12, I looked toward the window overlooking downtown Billings. It's a long story. She waited. I didn't continue. Eventually, she sighed. You're impossible. That's what my mother used to say. That earned a brief smile. Then the courtroom doors opened again. A paramedic stepped inside. Mr. Whitaker's stable. Nobody responded. The paramedic looked around awkwardly before leaving. Judge Benson remained seated behind the bench. His eyes never left me. Finally, he spoke. Miss Whitaker. I prefer Ms. Whitaker. He nodded. Ms. Whitaker. Silence filled the room. Then he asked the question everyone wanted answered. How do you know that designation? I almost laughed. Designation. Not name. Not nickname. Designation. That single word told me everything. He knew exactly what Raven-12 was, or at least enough to be frightened by it. I'm guessing you know, I replied. His jaw tightened. The judge looked toward my attorney. Ms. Keller, court is adjourned until Monday. Monday, she asked. That's 4 days away. Monday. His tone left no room for discussion. The hearing ended. Just like that. No ruling. No decision. No explanation. After everything that had happened, we were simply sent home. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering. Small-town reporters, mostly. People from local papers and radio stations. They surrounded Tommy the moment he emerged. My brother looked exhausted. Is your father okay? Will the case continue? What happened in there? Tommy ignored them. For once in his life, he genuinely looked lost. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. As Susan and I walked toward the parking lot, a voice called out behind me. Ma'am. I turned. An older man stood near the courthouse entrance. Late 70s. Gray hair. Weathered face. Federal Marshal retirement pin on his jacket. Something about him felt familiar. He studied me carefully. Then his eyes widened. I'll be damned. I recognized him a second later. Marshal Grayson. He laughed softly. Thought that was you. Susan looked between us. You two know each other. The old marshal shook his head. Not exactly. Then he looked at me. Been a long time. Yes, sir. The respect in my voice was genuine. Years ago, our paths had crossed briefly during a federal operation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth discussing. But apparently he remembered. More importantly, Tommy heard everything. My brother had stopped halfway across the parking lot. He was staring. Confused. Concerned. For perhaps the first time in his life, he realized there might be entire chapters of my story he knew nothing about. I wished him luck. There were many. That evening, I drove back to the small motel where I was staying. The same motel I'd used during previous visits. The owner, Martha Jenkins, had known me since high school. She handed me my room key. Heard about court. News traveled fast in Montana. I smiled. I'm sure you did. She leaned across the counter. Your father still stubborn? I laughed. Some things never change. Neither do daughters. Her words stayed with me. Upstairs, I sat beside the window overlooking the highway. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. For a while, I simply watched traffic pass. It reminded me of evenings years ago aboard Navy installations. Long days, quiet nights, time to think. People often assume military service is full of excitement. Most of it isn't. Most of it is paperwork, waiting, sacrifice, distance. The real cost comes later, when you realize entire decades passed while you were somewhere else. My father never understood that. As far as he was concerned, I had abandoned Montana. Abandoned family. Abandoned responsibility. He never asked what I had actually been doing. Never asked where I'd gone. Never asked why. Perhaps because he didn't really want the answer. The next morning proved something had changed. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Susan, you need to hear this. I sat up straighter. What happened? I just got off the phone with one of Frank's attorneys. That surprised me. And apparently your father hired a private investigator last night. I wasn't shocked. That sounded exactly like him. What did the investigator find? Susan laughed. Not happily. Nervously. Nothing. What do you mean? I mean he quit. I frowned. Quit? He refunded the money. Now that got my attention. Why? Susan hesitated. He wouldn't say. That afternoon, however, we got our answer. A friend of Susan's worked in town. By pure coincidence, she'd spoken with the investigator. The man had been visibly shaken. According to her, he'd spent 12 hours trying to research my background. Military records, government records, employment history, everything. Then he abruptly stopped. When Frank demanded an explanation, the investigator said only one thing. One sentence. Nothing more. Nothing less. I can't help you, Frank. Then he hung up. And from what I later learned, my father stared at that silent phone for a very long time. Because for the first time in his life, Frank Whitaker had encountered something he couldn't control. And it terrified him. By Friday morning, the story had spread across 3 counties. Not because anyone knew what Raven-12 meant. Nobody did. The story spread because people had seen Judge Harold Benson's reaction. In a small Montana town, that was enough. Judges weren't supposed to get rattled, especially not Benson. For 20 years, he'd built a reputation as the calmest man in the room. The fact that he had practically ended the hearing after hearing 2 words from me became the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. The local diner buzzed with theories. The feed store buzzed with theories. The barbershop buzzed with theories. Most of them were ridiculous. I was supposedly a former CIA operative, a witness in a federal mob case, a Pentagon official, a fugitive, an undercover marshal. One theory even suggested I had secretly worked at Area 51. That one made me laugh. The truth was both less exciting and more complicated. But nobody was getting the truth from me. Not yet. I spent Friday afternoon driving out to the ranch. Not because I wanted a confrontation. Quite the opposite. I wanted to see the place my mother loved. The gravel road hadn't changed. Neither had the cottonwood trees lining the entrance. As my truck rolled toward the property, memories surfaced one after another. Summer mornings feeding horses. Winter evenings around the fireplace, my mother humming while she baked pies. For a moment, I wasn't 58. I was 12, and Mom was still alive. The ranch house came into view. A familiar ache settled in my chest. Some places carry memories so deeply that time barely touches them. This was one of those places. I parked near the old red barn. The paint had faded. The roof needed work. Still, it felt like home, or at least the closest thing I had left. I walked toward the fence line where my mother used to sit in the evenings. She'd bring coffee. I'd bring a book. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we wouldn't. Both seemed equally important. Standing there, I suddenly remembered the day she told me she'd changed her will. It had been 15 years earlier. We were sitting beneath the big cottonwood near the creek. I remember protesting immediately. Mom, Dad's going to lose his mind. She laughed. He usually does. I'm serious. So am I. I can still hear her voice. Soft. Steady. Certain. Sarah, this isn't about money. Then what's it about? She looked toward the pasture. It's about belonging. At the time, I didn't fully understand. Now I did. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew there would come a day when she wasn't around to remind me I mattered. The land was her way of doing it anyway. Around sunset, I heard another vehicle approaching. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. Tommy. My younger brother parked 20 yards away and climbed out. He looked older than I remembered. The years had not been especially kind to either of us. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence. "You could have called." I smiled faintly. "You could have answered." That ended the conversation before it began. Tommy shoved his hands into his pockets. "Dad's upset." I looked at him. "That's your opening argument." "It's the truth." "So is gravity." He sighed. The same sigh he'd been using since childhood whenever I became difficult. Or perhaps whenever I refused to surrender. "I don't understand why you're doing this." I laughed. That genuinely surprised me. "Doing what?" "Fighting." I stared at him. Then I stared a little longer, because I suddenly realized he meant it. He honestly didn't understand. "You think I'm fighting, aren't you?" "No, Tommy." I shook my head slowly. "Your father sued me." The words hit him harder than I expected. Not because they were new, because they were true. For years, Tommy had acted as though every family conflict somehow involved equal blame, as though fairness required splitting responsibility down the middle. Some situations don't work that way. Sometimes one person creates the problem. Sometimes another person simply refuses to disappear. He looked away. "Dad says you abandoned the family." There it was. The old accusation. The one I'd heard for decades. I took a slow breath. Then I asked a simple question. "When Mom got sick, who paid for her experimental treatment?" Tommy frowned. "What?" "Answer the question." "Dad did." "No." His eyes narrowed. I continued. "When the drought nearly cost the ranch 12 years ago, who covered the property taxes?" Silence. "Who paid for Uncle Robert's surgery?" More silence. Tommy stared at me. A strange expression crossed his face. Confusion. I reached into my purse, pulled out a folded envelope, handed it to him. Inside were copies of bank records, checks, transfers, receipts, years' worth, quiet contributions, anonymous assistance, emergency payments, thousands and thousands of dollars, all linked to me. Tommy's face slowly changed. He turned pages, then more pages, then more. Finally, he looked up. "You did all this?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I almost laughed, because the answer seemed obvious. "Mom knew." His throat tightened. "That's it." That was enough. For several moments neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby a horse snorted softly. Finally, Tommy sat down on the fence rail. He looked exhausted, like a man discovering he had misunderstood an entire story. "I didn't know." "I know." His voice dropped. "Dad didn't know either." That earned a sad smile. "Tommy." "What?" He never wanted to know. The difference mattered. A lot. Later that evening, after Tommy left, my phone rang. Susan. Her voice sounded unusually serious. "We have a development." I leaned against the porch railing. "What kind of development?" "A lawyer arrived from Washington this afternoon." I frowned. "Washington State." "No." She paused. "Washington, D.C." Now I was interested. "What does he want?" "Nobody knows." "Who does he represent?" Another pause. "That's the strange part." "What?" "Apparently he isn't representing anyone." I looked toward the darkening horizon. "Then why is he here?" Susan's answer sent a chill through me. "According to the hotel clerk, he came to observe Monday's hearing." The line went silent. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I had a feeling Monday was going to be very different. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Montana morning that makes people pull their jackets tighter and drive a little slower. I woke before sunrise. Not because I was nervous, because old habits die hard. Years of military service had trained my body to wake before the alarm. I made coffee in the motel room and sat by the window. The parking lot below was empty. For a few minutes everything felt peaceful. Then my phone rang. "Susan." "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." She laughed softly. "That's not reassuring. I wasn't trying to reassure you." "Fair enough." Before hanging up, she added something that caught my attention. "The lawyer from Washington is here." "Already?" "He arrived before 7. That was unusual. People don't fly across the country to attend small-town property disputes. Not unless something else is happening. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stared out the window for a long time. Because deep down I knew exactly what was happening. The problem wasn't Raven-12. The problem was recognition. There are moments in life when a single word reaches the wrong ears. And suddenly people start remembering things they'd rather forget. The courthouse looked different that morning. Busier. Tenser. People gathered outside before the doors even opened. Reporters had doubled since Thursday. The local radio station was broadcasting from the sidewalk. Everyone wanted answers. Nobody had any. As I walked toward the entrance, conversations stopped. People stared. I wasn't famous. I wasn't important. But I had become the center of a mystery. And people love mysteries. Inside the courthouse, security seemed tighter than before. Even the deputies looked uncomfortable. One of them recognized me. His expression immediately changed. Not fear. Respect. The kind that comes from hearing rumors you don't fully understand. I nodded politely and continued inside. When I entered the courtroom, my father was already there. So was Tommy. Neither looked rested. Frank Whitaker looked 10 years older than he had 4 days earlier. His collapse hadn't been a heart attack. The doctors later called it a stress-induced episode. His body had simply reached its limit. For years, he had controlled every room he entered, every conversation, every relationship. Then suddenly he found himself facing something he couldn't understand. It was eating him alive. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. That alone told me everything. My father had never looked away before. Not once. A few minutes later, Judge Benson entered. The entire room stood, then sat. The difference was immediate. Thursday's judge had been confident, relaxed, almost arrogant. Monday's judge looked like a man carrying a burden. He shuffled papers unnecessarily, adjusted his glasses repeatedly, avoided eye contact. The courtroom noticed. So did my father. And that worried him more than anything else, because Dad had spent his entire life reading people. He knew fear when he saw it. The hearing began. For several minutes, nobody mentioned Raven-12. Instead, we discussed property boundaries, inheritance law, tax records, routine legal matters. But everyone knew we were simply circling the real issue. Eventually, Judge Benson stopped speaking. He looked directly at me, then at my attorney, then back at me. Finally, he asked, "Ms. Whitaker," his voice sounded careful, very careful, "would you be willing to clarify your statement from Thursday?" The room became silent. I folded my hands. "What statement?" "You know which one." I did, but I wanted him to say it. The judge hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Raven-12." Across the room, my father visibly tensed. Tommy leaned forward. The reporters began scribbling notes. I took a slow breath, then answered honestly, "Probably not." The judge frowned. "Probably. Most of it isn't mine to discuss." That was true. And everyone could hear it, the difference between refusing and being unable. The judge understood immediately. So did the man from Washington. I noticed him for the first time sitting near the back row. Mid-60s. Expensive suit. Federal posture. Watching everything. Saying nothing. The hearing paused for recess shortly before noon. As people filtered into the hallway, something unexpected happened. Judge Benson approached me privately. Not as a judge, as a man. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he spoke. "I haven't heard that designation in almost 30 years. I studied him carefully. "Neither have I." His expression darkened. "I was a federal prosecutor back then." There it was. Finally. A piece of the puzzle. The judge continued. "There was an operation." I said nothing. He nodded. "Most records disappeared." "Yes. Most people involved disappeared too." "Also true." The judge swallowed hard. His voice lowered. "Some of us believed everyone connected to it was gone. Now I understood his reaction. Not fear. Shock. The same kind of shock you'd feel if someone walked into a room after being presumed dead for decades. The problem was that nobody had actually thought I was dead. What disappeared wasn't the people. It was the story. The records. The names. The memories. The entire operation had quietly faded into history. Exactly as intended. The judge looked exhausted. "Why bring it up now?" For the first time, I smiled sadly. "Because my father spent 30 years pretending I was nobody." Judge Benson glanced toward the courtroom, toward Frank Whitaker, then back at me. And suddenly he understood. This was never about classified programs, never about government secrets, never about national security. It was about a daughter. A daughter whose own father never cared enough to ask where she had been. When recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. The atmosphere had changed. The mystery remained, but the focus was shifting. People were beginning to realize the story wasn't Raven-12. The story was Frank Whitaker, and the daughter he never bothered to know. The hearing resumed. My attorney presented evidence. Financial records, property documents, historical ownership records. Then she introduced something new. A collection of payments, medical bills, emergency expenses, tax records, all linked to me, all connected to helping the family over the years. The courtroom grew quiet. Tommy looked stunned. Again, my father looked worse. Each document felt like another brick removed from the wall he'd built around himself. The wall that said I didn't care, that I had abandoned everyone, that I owed nothing, and received nothing. The truth was far less convenient. For years I had helped quietly, without credit, without acknowledgement, without expectation, because my mother would have wanted it that way. When Susan finished, silence filled the room. My father stared at the documents, then at me. For the first time in decades, he looked confused. Not angry, not defensive. Confused. Like a man discovering he had been reading the wrong map his entire life. Then suddenly his hand moved to his chest. Tommy noticed first. "Dad!" Frank didn't answer. His face had gone pale. The courtroom erupted into motion, and as doctors rushed toward him, I realized something important. My father wasn't collapsing because of Raven-12. He was collapsing because the truth finally weighed more than the lies. The second collapse happened in complete silence. One moment my father was sitting at the plaintiff's table. The next he was gripping his chest. His face had gone gray. Not pale. Gray. The kind of color that instantly makes everyone in the room understand something is wrong. "Dad," Tommy was already moving. The judge stood. The bailiff called for medical assistance. People rushed forward. For a few seconds, nobody cared about lawsuits, property rights, or courtroom procedure. They cared about a 79-year-old man struggling to breathe. I remained seated, not because I didn't care, because I couldn't move. I was watching the strongest man from my childhood suddenly look fragile, and no matter how complicated our history had become, that was difficult to see. Very difficult. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They stabilized him and transported him to St. Vincent Regional Hospital. The hearing ended immediately. No objections, no arguments, no complaints, just silence. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it actually was. Susan offered to come. I declined. This wasn't a legal matter anymore. It was family. And family has a way of becoming complicated when nobody is billing by the hour. By the time I arrived, Tommy was sitting alone in the waiting room. His elbows rested on his knees. His hands were clasped together. He looked exhausted. When he saw me, he didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't understand any of this." I sat beside him. "I know." "No, I mean it." He looked genuinely defeated. "Everything I thought I knew keeps turning out wrong." I stared at the floor tiles. For once, I had no clever response, because I understood exactly how he felt. Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't learning new information. It's realizing old information was never true. A doctor eventually appeared. Middle-aged, calm, professional. "He'll be fine." Tommy exhaled so hard it almost sounded painful. The doctor continued. "Stress played a major role." I almost laughed at that. If stress could be measured like rainfall, my father had spent decades standing in a hurricane. The doctor left. Tommy remained silent. Then he looked at me. "Will you see him?" The question surprised me. A week earlier, I would have answered no, without hesitation, without guilt. Now I wasn't sure. Eventually, I nodded. "Yes." My father looked smaller in a hospital bed. It's strange how illness can do that. The same man who once seemed larger than life now appeared ordinary. Just another elderly patient attached to monitors. Just another man growing old. When I entered the room, he was awake. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other, neither knowing where to begin. Finally, he spoke. "You're still here." His voice sounded weak. I pulled a chair closer. "Apparently." A faint smile appeared, then disappeared. The room became quiet again. Outside, I could hear distant hospital activity. Nurses walking, phones ringing, life continuing. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. "Tommy told me about the money." I said nothing. "He showed me the records." Still nothing. My father looked toward the window. "You paid for your mother's treatment." "Yes." "You helped the ranch." "Yes." "More than once." "Yes." The answers came easily. The silence afterward didn't, because neither of us knew what to do with the truth. Finally, he asked the question that mattered. "Why?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the age lines. The gray hair. The exhaustion. And suddenly I saw something I'd never noticed before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of regret. I loved Mom. My answer was simple. It mattered to her. His eyes closed. For a moment I thought he might cry. Instead, he nodded, slowly, as though absorbing something painful. Then he asked another question, the one everyone had wanted answered. Were you some kind of spy? Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in days. My father looked offended. What? I shook my head. That's what you're worried about. People keep talking. It's a small town. That isn't an answer. No. He waited. I waited. Eventually he sighed. So what were you? The room grew quiet. I could have told him about assignments, operations, classifications, years spent serving in places he never knew existed. I could have explained Raven-12, at least the parts I was allowed to explain. But suddenly none of it seemed important. Not anymore. So I gave him the only answer that mattered. I was your daughter. The words landed harder than any secret ever could. I watched them hit him. Watched understanding slowly replace confusion. For years my father had focused on what I did, where I went, what title I held, what records existed, what records didn't. And in doing so he missed something obvious. The person standing in front of him, his daughter. Nothing else should have mattered. Yet somehow everything else had. His eyes filled with tears. The sight stunned me. Frank Whitaker didn't cry. At least not when I was growing up. I never saw it happen. Not once. Now tears sat openly in his eyes, and he made no attempt to hide them. I failed you. The words were barely audible. I looked away. Not because I disagreed. Because hearing them hurt more than I expected. The child inside me had waited decades for that apology. Now that it finally arrived, I wasn't sure what to do with it. My father continued. I kept thinking you'd come back and become who I wanted. I stared at the floor. When that didn't happen, his voice cracked. I got angry. Neither of us spoke. The monitors quietly beeped beside the bed. Finally, he whispered something that changed everything. I treated you like an enemy. The honesty caught me off guard. Because it was true. Painfully true. For years, every success I'd achieved somehow offended him. Every accomplishment became evidence I was leaving. Every choice became a rejection. Not because I hated him. Because I was becoming myself. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. His shoulders sagged. Years of stubborn pride finally collapsing. Then came the question. The hardest one. Can you forgive me? The room felt very still. I thought about childhood. About my mother. About years of silence. About all the things we'd lost. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It doesn't happen instantly. Not real forgiveness. Real forgiveness takes time. Patience. Honesty. Sometimes more than one conversation. So I didn't lie. I didn't offer a dramatic speech. I didn't give him the ending he wanted. Instead, I reached over and adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder, the same way my mother used to. Then I stood. And before leaving the room, I quietly said, I came to the hospital, didn't I? For the first time all day, my father smiled. Not a victorious smile. Not a proud smile. Just a hopeful one. And somehow that felt like a beginning. 3 months later, I stood on the front porch of the Whitaker Ranch and watched the sun rise over the Montana hills. The morning air carried the scent of grass and distant rain. A herd of cattle moved slowly across the eastern pasture. Nothing seemed different. And yet everything was. The lawsuit was over. Not because somebody won. Because eventually nobody wanted to keep fighting. After my father's hospitalization, something shifted. Not immediately. People like Frank Whitaker don't change overnight. Neither do daughters who spent decades protecting themselves. But little things began happening. Conversations. Questions. Moments. The kinds of moments families usually have years earlier. We were having them at 79 and 58. Late was still better than never. The legal resolution surprised almost everyone. Including my attorneys, the evidence had become overwhelming. The ranch records were clear. My mother's will was clear. The financial records were clear. If the case continued, I would almost certainly win. Completely. My father knew it. His attorneys knew it. The judge knew it. So 1 week after leaving the hospital, my father called. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. But it changed everything. I want to settle. I stood in my Virginia kitchen holding the phone. What kind of settlement? A long silence followed. Then he answered. The honest kind. For once there were no conditions. No tricks. No hidden demands. No attempts to control the outcome. Just honesty. It felt strange. Almost unfamiliar. The final agreement gave me exactly what my mother intended. My legal share remained intact. No reduction. No compromise. No surrender. After 30 years, I had finally stopped letting my father decide my value. That alone felt like victory. But then came a second decision. One nobody expected. Including my father. including Tommy, including me. Because after the paperwork was completed, I spent several nights thinking about what came next. The easy option would have been selling. Many people advised it. Take the money. Walk away. Close the chapter. Move on. A younger version of me might have done exactly that. But age changes your perspective. You begin measuring success differently. At 25, I wanted justice. At 58, I wanted peace. They are not always the same thing. One afternoon, I drove to the ranch alone. I walked the property for nearly 3 hours. Past the creek, past the cottonwoods, past the fence where Mom and I used to sit. Every corner held memories, some painful, some beautiful, most of them both. By sunset, I had made my decision. I wasn't selling. I wasn't seeking revenge. And I wasn't fighting anymore. Instead, I created something new. The Evelyn Whitaker Conservation Trust. Named after my mother, the woman who quietly held our family together long after she was gone. The trust protected the land from future development, protected the wildlife habitat, protected the ranch itself. Future generations could still work it, still live on it, still belong there, the way Mom always wanted. When I explained the idea to Tommy, he stared at me for nearly a full minute. Then he laughed. You realize most people would have burned the place down by now. I smiled. Good thing I'm not most people. He nodded. Mom would have liked this. That meant more than he realized. By autumn, life settled into something resembling normal, or perhaps a new version of normal. The kind older people eventually learned to appreciate. No grand dramatic reconciliation. No movie ending. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were small things. Phone calls. Coffee. Conversations. The occasional awkward silence. Those mattered more. One October afternoon, I returned to Montana again. The leaves had turned gold. The mountains stood sharp against a blue sky. As I approached the ranch house, I spotted my father sitting on the porch, alone. A blanket rested across his lap. For a moment, I simply watched him. The man looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just older. Age eventually humbles everyone. Even Frank Whitaker. Especially Frank Whitaker. I climbed the porch steps carrying 2 cups of coffee. He looked up. You're late. I handed him a cup. You sound healthier. Doctor says I'm difficult. I laughed. That diagnosis isn't new. A smile appeared. The genuine kind. We sat quietly, watching the property, watching the afternoon drift by, neither rushing to fill the silence. For the first time in our lives, silence didn't feel hostile. It felt comfortable. Eventually, children appeared near the pasture. Tommy's grandchildren. My grandnieces and grandnephews, running, laughing, chasing each other through the grass. My father watched them carefully. Then he spoke. You know what bothers me most? I looked over. What? He took a long sip of coffee. I wasted a lot of years. The honesty didn't surprise me anymore. 3 months ago it would have. Not now. I nodded. Yeah. Another silence followed. Then he added something unexpected. I'm glad I got a few back. The words hung between us. Simple, unpolished. True. I looked toward the horizon. The same horizon my mother had loved. The same one she'd watched while imagining a future neither of us could see yet. Maybe she knew something we didn't. Maybe she understood that healing isn't dramatic. It's gradual, quiet, built one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one act of grace at a time. The sun began sinking behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Beside me, my father sat quietly. Not healed completely. Neither was I. Some scars remain. That's part of being human. But we were finally facing the same direction. And for now, that was enough. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, someone you've lost, forgiven, misunderstood, or perhaps still hope to reconnect with, take a moment and think of them today. And if you believe that understanding can arrive even after years of silence, feel free to share your thoughts below. Stories like these remind us that sometimes the most important conversations happen later than we planned, but they still matter. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to hear more stories about family resilience and second chances, I'd be honored if you joined us again. Couldn't afford a lawyer. My father's voice carried across the courtroom loud enough for everyone to hear. A few people sitting behind him chuckled under their breath. I kept walking. The heels of my navy dress shoes clicked softly against the old tile floor inside the Norfolk County Probate Court. I held a worn leather folder tightly against my chest and took my seat alone at the defense table. Dad leaned back in his chair wearing the same smug expression I'd seen my whole life whenever he thought he had the upper hand. My mother crossed her arms beside him and smiled thinly. "This'll be quick," she whispered. I don't think she meant for me to hear it. But I did. Their attorney, a heavyset man named Richard Bellamy, adjusted his expensive tie and glanced at me with open pity. Or maybe contempt. Hard to tell sometimes. Judge Harold Bennett entered the courtroom a moment later and everyone rose. I stood straight automatically. 20 years in the Navy trains certain habits into your bones. The judge sat down, adjusted his glasses, and began reviewing the probate file involving my grandmother Linda Carter's estate. Outside the tall courthouse windows, rain tapped softly against the glass. The whole room smelled faintly like old paper and wet coats. Mr. Bellamy stood first. "Your Honor, this is a very simple matter involving property transfer and estate clarification." Then the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. An older woman with silver hair stepped inside carrying a sealed manila envelope. The judge immediately recognized her. "So good to see you again, Ms. Holloway," he said carefully. Richard Bellamy's confidence vanished instantly. Margaret Holloway walked toward the bench with slow, steady steps that somehow made the entire room quieter. I saw my father frown. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered. Margaret handed the envelope to the judge. "Direct instructions from Linda Carter," she said calmly. "To be opened only if her granddaughter appeared in court without representation." The judge broke the seal. He read the first page silently. Then he stopped. Actually stopped breathing for a second. Mr. Bellamy frowned uneasily. "Your Honor." The judge handed him the document. Bellamy's face drained of color so fast it honestly frightened me. "Oh my God," he whispered. My father leaned forward. "What?" Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom of the page like he'd seen a ghost. "Oh my God, look at that signature." Dad's knees buckled against the wooden chair. "Linda?" And that was the moment my family realized Grandma hadn't left this world nearly as helpless as they believed. 3 weeks earlier, I stood alone in a cemetery outside Raleigh, North Carolina, while cold February wind blew through rows of gray headstones. My grandmother had always hated dramatic funerals. "Waste of money," she used to say. So the service was small, quiet, simple. Just the way she wanted. I wore my Navy dress whites because I'd flown in directly from Norfolk Naval Station after my leave request was finally approved. My parents didn't hug me when I arrived. Dad barely even looked at me. He just nodded toward my uniform. "You still doing all that Navy stuff?" All that Navy stuff. 20 years of service reduced to a sentence. I should have been used to it by then. But somehow it still hurt. Inside the church fellowship hall after the burial, people gathered around folding tables, eating casseroles and banana pudding, while soft country gospel music played from an old speaker near the kitchen. My mother spent most of the afternoon discussing Grandma's property. Not grieving. Not remembering. Just discussing assets. "The taxes alone are going to be a nightmare," she complained while stirring sweet tea. Dad nodded. "We'll probably sell the farmhouse fast as possible." I looked up sharply. Dad gave me a confused look like I'd spoken out of turn. "Well, obviously." I stared at him for several seconds. Grandma Linda's farmhouse sat on 12 acres outside town. It wasn't some giant fortune, but the place mattered to her. That porch, those gardens, the old oak tree out front where she used to sit every evening reading mystery novels while drinking coffee. That house held her whole life. "You already decided to sell it?" I asked quietly. Mom sighed dramatically. "Emily, honey, these things are complicated. You live in Virginia. You're never here." "Never here." I heard that phrase most of my adult life. Never here for birthdays. Never here for Christmas. Never here when Dad had surgery. Never here when the roof leaked. As if military service was some selfish vacation I'd chosen to avoid them. My older brother Mark avoided eye contact completely while shoving deviled eggs onto a paper plate. That was Mark's specialty. Avoiding things. Especially conflict. Especially when our parents were wrong. Dad lowered his voice. "Besides, your grandmother depended on us those last few years." I nearly laughed. Depended on them. I was the one calling her every Sunday from whatever base or deployment zone I happened to be stationed in. I was the one paying for the new water heater 2 winters ago after Grandma quietly admitted she couldn't afford it. I was the one she trusted enough to tell the truth, and the truth was simple. My parents visited Linda when it benefited them. I visited because I loved her. That night after everyone left, I drove alone to the small roadside motel outside town where I always stayed during visits home. The same faded sign buzzed outside. The same floral bedspread. The same smell of old carpet and cigarette smoke buried deep in the walls despite years of no-smoking policies. I sat on the edge of the bed still wearing part of my uniform. That's when I opened Grandma's final letter. Her handwriting shook more than it used to, but it was still unmistakably hers. Emily, if you're reading this, I'm probably somewhere arguing with St. Peter about his coffee. Now listen carefully. You were never hard to love. Don't let anybody rewrite your life and convince you otherwise. I had to stop reading for a minute after that, because no one had ever said those words to me before. Not once. Not in 38 years. Outside rain tapped softly against the motel window. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. Suddenly I was 19 again, standing in our kitchen with Navy recruitment papers in my hand while Dad shouted that military women ended up lonely and bitter. Mom cried because she thought I'd never get married. Mark sat there silently eating mashed potatoes. Only Grandma Linda smiled. She drove me to the recruiter's office herself the next morning in her old Buick. You go see the world, she told me. What if I fail, I asked. She squeezed my hand. Then fail bravely. I still remembered those words 20 years later. The next morning after the funeral, Dad called me before sunrise. Not to ask how I was doing. Not to talk about Grandma. He called about court. Apparently, Linda's estate documents had complications. And somehow those complications were serious enough to involve probate litigation. You probably ought to get yourself a lawyer, Dad said casually. I looked out the motel window toward the empty highway. Why? There was a pause. Then he answered carefully. Well, because your grandmother left some confusing paperwork. That was the first moment I realized something bigger was happening beneath the surface. And somehow, Grandma had known it was coming. I didn't sleep much after my father's phone call. The rain continued most of the night, tapping softly against the motel window, while 18-wheelers rumbled down the highway outside. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up pretending to sleep and walked to the small coffee machine near the motel office. The coffee tasted burnt enough to strip paint. Grandma would have laughed at that. Bad coffee builds character, she always said. I sat alone in the dim lobby, holding the paper cup with both hands while trying to make sense of everything. Probate litigation. Confusing paperwork. Get yourself a lawyer. None of it sounded right. Grandma Linda had been organized her entire life. The woman labeled extension cords in her garage. She kept appliance warranties from the 1980s in neat folders. There was no universe where she accidentally created legal confusion, which meant one thing: whatever was happening was intentional. The next afternoon I drove out to Linda's farmhouse. The gravel road looked smaller than I remembered. Winter had stripped most of the trees bare, and the old white farmhouse sat beneath gray Carolina skies like something quietly waiting to be forgotten. Dad's truck already sat parked outside. So did Mom's SUV. I stayed in my car for a moment, watching them through the windshield. My father stood near the barn talking with a realtor. Already. Grandma had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. Something inside me hardened a little then. Not anger exactly. Just clarity. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. Dad looked annoyed the second he saw me. What are you doing here? I stared at him. It's Grandma's house. He crossed his arms. Not for long. The realtor awkwardly pretended to examine the property line, while my mother emerged from the front door carrying a cardboard box filled with Linda's things. Family photographs, cookbooks, old letters. My chest tightened immediately. Mom, I said carefully, what are you doing? Cleaning. She just died. Mom sighed dramatically like I was being difficult on purpose. Emily, this isn't a movie. Real life keeps moving. Real life. Another phrase people use when they want permission to behave badly. I walked past them into the house. The smell hit me first. Coffee. Lavender. Old wood. Grandma. Everything looked exactly the same. Her knitted blanket still draped across the couch. Reading glasses sat beside the recliner near the lamp. A half-finished crossword puzzle rested on the kitchen table. For one impossible second, it felt like she might walk in from the garden any minute asking whether I wanted pie. Then reality settled back in, and the silence hurt worse than I expected. I slowly walked toward the hallway when my father's voice followed behind me. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly near the end. I turned around. What's that supposed to mean? Dad rubbed his jaw. She got confused sometimes. That was a lie. And we both knew it. Linda Carter was sharper at 82 than most people were at 50. 3 months earlier, she'd beaten me at poker while explaining why the Navy overpaid defense contractors. Confused people don't do that. Mom placed the cardboard box on the table. There were papers everywhere, she added carefully. Legal papers, notes, financial stuff. What kind of papers? Dad answered too quickly. Nothing important. That's when I knew. They were hiding something. That evening after they finally left, I stayed alone at the farmhouse. The quiet there felt different from the quiet inside my apartment back in Norfolk. This quiet had memory inside it. I wandered slowly through each room, touching familiar things. The hallway wall still displayed my Navy graduation photo from Great Lakes. Not Mark's high school football picture. Not Dad's business award. Mine. Grandma always kept mine in the center. I smiled faintly at that. Then I noticed something strange. One picture frame near the hallway looked crooked. Grandma hated crooked frames. I lifted it carefully. Behind it sat a small sealed envelope taped to the wall. My heart started pounding immediately. Across the front in Linda's shaky handwriting were 5 words. For Emily, if necessary. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was another letter. Short. Direct. Exactly like her. Sweetheart, if your parents challenge my wishes, call Margaret Holloway immediately. Trust nobody else. The number is attached. And Emily, I know exactly what I'm doing. Love always, Grandma. Attached beneath the note was a business card. Margaret Holloway, Esquire. Washington, D.C. Military Estate and Federal Counsel. I stared at the card for a long time. Then I laughed softly to myself. Of course. Of course Grandma had planned ahead. I first met Margaret Holloway when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was stationed in Bahrain during one of the hardest years of my Navy career. My marriage had collapsed after endless deployments and distance. My ex-husband finally admitted he was tired of living with the Navy version of me. I remember calling Grandma from overseas one night after signing divorce papers. I cried harder than I intended. Not because I lost the marriage, but because I felt like I'd failed at being normal. Failed at being a woman somehow. Grandma listened quietly for nearly an hour. Then she said something I never forgot. Emily, there's nothing wrong with women who survive differently. A week later, care packages started arriving from home. Cookies, coffee, handwritten jokes, new socks, and one legal packet containing financial documents I needed for the divorce. Inside was a note. Margaret helped organize this. She's smarter than most senators. That was Linda. Even her comfort came prepared. The next morning, I finally called the number. A calm older woman answered on the second ring. Margaret Holloway speaking. This is Emily Carter, I said nervously. Linda Carter's granddaughter. Silence. Then her voice softened instantly. Oh, sweetheart. Just those 2 words nearly broke me. She told me you might call, Margaret continued gently. You knew Grandma. Knew her, honey. Your grandmother saved my career in 1978. That surprised me enough to laugh. What? Margaret chuckled softly. We worked together at a military law office in D.C. long before you were born. Linda was the smartest legal secretary I ever met. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly pieces started connecting. The organized paperwork. The hidden letters. The confidence. She planned this, didn't she? I whispered. Margaret paused carefully. Your grandmother understood people better than they understood themselves. That sounded exactly like Linda. Margaret continued. Emily, your grandmother was deeply concerned before she passed. Concerned about what? Your parents. The room fell silent around me. Outside the farmhouse window, wind moved through the dead winter grass. She believed they intended to pressure the estate process after her death, Margaret explained calmly. So she prepared documentation in advance. I closed my eyes. Even now, even dying, Grandma was still protecting me. Margaret spoke again. Can you come to Norfolk next Thursday? That's the hearing date. I know. There was a long pause. Then Margaret said something that made my stomach tighten. Bring no attorney. What? Trust me. I stared out toward Grandma's garden. Dead roses bent beneath cold February wind. Okay, I whispered finally. Margaret's voice softened again. Your grandmother loved you very much, Emily. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling afraid. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the motel bathroom mirror, buttoning my Navy dress uniform with hands that looked steadier than I felt. Outside, Norfolk was wrapped in cold gray rain again. Funny how storms seem to arrive exactly when life turns heavy. I stared at my reflection for a long moment. 38 years old. Commander's pin on my collar. 20 years of service. 2 deployments in the Persian Gulf. A Navy Achievement Medal. A divorce. No children. No real place that ever fully felt like home. And somehow, one probate courtroom still had the power to make me feel 12 years old again. I picked up Grandma Linda's letter from the sink counter and folded it carefully into my inside coat pocket. Then I drove to court alone. The courthouse parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. My parents stood near the entrance beneath a black umbrella while their attorney smoked beside the sidewalk. My older brother Mark lingered nearby with his hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. The second Dad saw me, his mouth tightened. "You really came without counsel?" I locked my car quietly. "That seems to bother you." Dad scoffed. "It concerns me." No, it didn't. What concerned him was uncertainty. My father liked situations he could control. Predictable things. Weak people. And today, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't completely sure what I knew. Mom stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Emily, there's still time to handle this privately." I looked at her carefully. "Privately," Dad answered before she could. "Your grandmother was confused near the end. We don't want the court wasting time over paperwork mistakes." There it was again. Confused. I felt anger rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Grandma deserved better than a screaming match in a courthouse parking lot. So I simply asked, "What exactly are you afraid the judge might see?" Dad's face hardened immediately. "Don't start acting dramatic." Mark still said nothing. He just stared at the wet pavement like a man hoping the earth might open beneath him. We walked inside together in silence. Probate courtroom B felt too small for the amount of tension sitting inside it. Old wooden pews lined the room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere nearby, a copier machine clicked endlessly through courthouse walls. A few local townspeople sat quietly in the back rows. Small-town gossip travels fast, especially when family money's involved. Richard Bellamy stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, organizing stacks of paperwork. He smiled politely at me, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Commander Carter," he said. "Still no attorney?" "No, sir." His smile widened slightly. "Well, that's certainly your choice." Translation: "You're about to lose badly." I took my seat without answering. Dad leaned toward Mom and whispered something that made her smirk. For a second, I remembered being 16 years old, sitting at our dinner table after telling my parents I wanted to apply for an ROTC scholarship. Dad laughed outright. "A girl from this family joining the military." Mom shook her head sadly. "You're too emotional for that kind of life." Funny thing about people who underestimate you. Eventually they start believing their own version of reality. Judge Bennett entered exactly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. The hearing began quickly. Bellamy moved first. "Your Honor, this matter concerns the estate of Linda Carter, deceased, specifically several irregular documents discovered shortly before probate transfer." He spoke smoothly, professionally, like a man fully convinced victory was routine. He presented my parents as devoted caregivers. Responsible. Self-sacrificing. He described me as largely absent from family affairs due to military obligations. That phrase irritated me more than it should have. Absent, as though serving your country erased your place in your own family. Bellamy continued. "The plaintiffs believe Ms. Carter may have exercised undue emotional influence over the deceased during periods of isolation." That finally made me look up sharply. Undue emotional influence? I almost laughed. Grandma Linda was the strongest-minded woman I'd ever known. Nobody manipulated her. Nobody. Judge Bennett adjusted his glasses. "Commander Carter," he said calmly, "do you intend to respond?" Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me. My parents looked almost eager. I stood slowly and said exactly what Margaret instructed me to say. "I was advised to wait, Your Honor." Confusion flickered across Bellamy's face. Dad frowned. The judge looked mildly irritated. "Wait for what?" Before I could answer, the courtroom doors opened. Again. Margaret Holloway entered wearing a dark navy coat and carrying a leather briefcase. Even at her age, she moved with remarkable confidence. The entire atmosphere shifted instantly. Bellamy's posture changed first, then the judge's expression, then everyone else's. Judge Bennett actually stood halfway from his chair. "Ms. Holloway." Margaret nodded politely. "Your Honor." Bellamy looked stunned. "You're representing Commander Carter." Margaret removed a pair of reading glasses calmly. "Number." Bellamy blinked. "No. I'm here representing the documented final directives of Linda Carter." Silence settled across the courtroom. Real silence. The kind that makes people suddenly aware of every tiny sound in the room. Rain against windows. Paper shifting. Someone coughing quietly in the back row. Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a sealed file. "Your Honor," she said, "Linda Carter prepared legal contingencies several years ago in anticipation of precisely this situation." Dad's face lost color immediately. How he whispered. Margaret ignored him. She handed the documents to the judge. Judge Bennett reviewed the first pages silently, then slower, then very slowly. His eyebrows lifted. Richard Bellamy shifted uneasily beside the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor," he asked carefully. The judge handed him the file. Bellamy scanned the documents. I watched the exact moment panic entered his eyes. His face drained completely. "Oh my God," he whispered. Dad leaned forward sharply. "What is it?" Bellamy kept reading. There were notarized property transfers, medical evaluations confirming Linda's mental competency, recorded financial statements, and handwritten testimony documenting repeated pressure attempts made by my parents during Linda's final year. But that wasn't the part that shattered the room. The final page did that. Bellamy stared at the signature at the bottom like he couldn't process what he was seeing. "Oh my God," he repeated quietly. Then he looked directly at my father. "You told me Linda Carter handled this paperwork herself." Dad swallowed hard. "She did." Bellamy's voice dropped. "No, sir, she absolutely did not." Mom gripped the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" Bellamy turned the final page toward them. At the bottom sat the signature that changed everything. Margaret Holloway, former federal military counsel, former advisor to the Department of the Navy, one of the most respected estate litigators on the East Coast. Dad's knees literally buckled against his chair. "Linda," he whispered weakly. And suddenly I understood. Grandma hadn't just prepared paperwork. She had built a shield around me years before she died. Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. Based on these filings, he said carefully, the court recognizes full legal transfer authority previously granted to Commander Emily Carter. The room stayed completely still. Then the judge added the sentence that finally broke my parents completely. And furthermore, this court will review evidence suggesting possible coercion attempts against the deceased. Mom burst into tears instantly. Dad turned toward Bellamy in panic. "You said this was routine." Bellamy stared at him coldly now. "Sir, you failed to disclose critical information. For the first time in my entire life." My father looked afraid of me. Not angry. Not disappointed. Afraid. And honestly, that hurt more than I expected it would. The hearing ended less than 40 minutes later. 40 minutes. That was all it took to unravel years of lies, assumptions, and quiet family manipulation. People always imagine courtroom victories as dramatic celebrations, music swelling, heroes walking confidently into sunlight. Real life doesn't feel like that. Real life feels exhausting. By the time I stepped outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky still hung low and gray over downtown Norfolk. Reporters weren't waiting. No applause echoed through the streets. Just cold wind, traffic, and the strange emptiness that comes after emotional shock. Margaret Holloway walked beside me quietly, carrying her leather briefcase. "You handled yourself well," she said. I gave a tired laugh. I barely spoke. That's usually wiser in court. We stopped near the courthouse steps. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I looked at her. "How long did Grandma plan this?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Longer than you realize." I shook my head slowly. She knew they'd challenge everything. She hoped they wouldn't, Margaret answered gently. But Linda understood human nature very well. That sounded exactly right. Grandma trusted carefully, loved deeply, and prepared thoroughly. Margaret adjusted her coat against the wind. She worried less about the property, she admitted, and more about what your parents might do to you emotionally once she was gone. That sentence hit harder than the court ruling itself. Because it was true. This was never only about land, or money, or a farmhouse. It was about power. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who spent years being treated like an outsider inside their own family. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone already contained 6 missed calls. 3 from Mom, 2 from Dad, 1 from Mark. I ignored all of them. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply couldn't handle another conversation yet. Instead, I drove back to Linda's farmhouse. The farther I got from Norfolk, the quieter my thoughts became. Rainwater still clung to the fields along the highway. Bare trees blurred past my windows while old country songs played softly through the radio speakers. At some point during the drive, I realized something strange. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Deeply sad. Because court had confirmed something I spent most of my life trying not to admit. My parents never truly understood me. Maybe they never wanted to. The farmhouse looked softer in the late afternoon light. I parked beside the porch and sat in the car for several minutes before finally going inside. The house greeted me with silence again. But not empty silence, comfortable silence. Linda's kind of silence. I made coffee automatically using the old machine she'd owned since I was in high school. The thing sounded like a lawnmower every time it brewed. Grandma refused to replace it. Suffering builds appreciation, she used to joke. I carried the mug into the living room and sat in her recliner. That's when the memories started arriving harder than before. Birthdays missed during deployment. Christmas video calls from military bases overseas. Promotions my parents barely acknowledged. The time Dad told neighbors Mark was the one who stayed loyal to the family, as if service members abandoned people by serving elsewhere. I stared at the family photographs lining the shelf. Most included Mark. His baseball trophies, his wedding, his children. Normal milestones. Traditional milestones, the kind my parents understood. Then there was me, always in uniform, always leaving again, always slightly outside the picture even when standing inside it. I closed my eyes. And suddenly I remembered a conversation from years earlier. I had just returned from deployment overseas. Grandma and I sat together on this very porch drinking coffee while summer cicadas screamed through the trees. "You know what your problem is?" she asked me. I smiled. "Only one. You spend your whole life trying to earn love from people who already decided not to understand you." That memory nearly broke me now, because she was right. She had always been right. Around 7 o'clock, headlights appeared outside. I looked through the curtains and saw Mark climbing slowly out of his truck. Of everyone in the family, Mark looked the worst after court. Not angry, not defeated, ashamed. I opened the door before he reached the porch. He shoved his hands awkwardly into his pockets. Hey. Neither of us moved for a second. Then he asked quietly, "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Mark walked through the farmhouse slowly, like someone entering a church after years away. We sat at the kitchen table where Grandma used to serve pancakes every Sunday morning. For several minutes he said nothing. Finally he looked at me. I should have said something sooner. I already knew what he meant. But I let him say it anyway. "They treated you differently your whole life." I stared down at my coffee. Mark rubbed both hands over his face. "I knew it, Em." That nickname hurt unexpectedly. He hadn't called me that in years. He swallowed hard. I didn't want to fight with Dad. There it was. The truth. Simple, ugly, human. I nodded slowly. "You depended on him." "Yeah, you still do." Mark looked embarrassed. "Probably." Silence settled between us again. Then he laughed bitterly. "You know what's crazy?" "What?" "Grandma always talked about you like you were the brave one." I almost smiled. She exaggerated. "No," Mark said quietly, "she didn't." That hit me harder than I expected. Because Mark had spent most of our lives staying neutral, safe, watching conflict from the sidelines. Hearing him say that now mattered. Later that night, after Mark left, another car pulled into the driveway. This time it was my mother, alone. She stood on the porch, clutching her purse tightly against her chest, while cold wind moved through the dark yard behind her. For a moment she looked older than I'd ever seen her. Tired, too. I opened the door without speaking. Mom stepped inside carefully. "I won't stay long." I nodded toward the kitchen. She sat down slowly at the table but didn't remove her coat. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally she whispered, "She always admired you." I looked up. "Grandma." Mom nodded. "She used to talk about you constantly." Something tightened painfully inside my chest. Mom stared down at her hands. "She admired your independence." I waited quietly. Then Mom said the sentence I never expected to hear from her. "You became everything I never had the courage to be." The room went completely still. Outside wind rattled softly against the farmhouse windows. I stared at my mother while years of resentment, confusion, and sadness shifted uneasily inside me. And for the first time in my life, I realized she might have been afraid too. My mother stayed at the farmhouse less than 20 minutes that night. Long enough to say things neither of us fully knew how to handle. Not long enough to fix 38 years of distance. Before leaving, she paused beside the front door with her hand resting on the knob. "I know your father went too far," she said quietly. I folded my arms. "You went along with it." She nodded once. "No excuses." Honestly, that surprised me more than denial would have. Mom looked around the farmhouse slowly. "She loved this place." "I know. She wanted you here." My throat tightened slightly. Then Mom said something that stayed with me long after she drove away. "You know, when you joined the Navy, your father thought you were rejecting us." I frowned. "I joined because I needed my own life. I know that now. But back then they didn't. Or maybe they couldn't." Some parents confuse independence with abandonment, especially when their children grow into people they no longer control. After she left, I locked the front door and walked quietly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The farmhouse creaked softly beneath my footsteps. Every corner held memory. Grandma teaching me how to make biscuits in the kitchen. Grandma showing me constellations from the backyard during humid Carolina summers. Grandma driving me to the recruiter's office while Dad refused to speak to me. She had been the bridge between me and the rest of the family for years, and now she was gone. I sat down at the kitchen table around midnight holding the final sealed letter Margaret had given me after court. "Linda wanted you to read this only after the hearing," she'd said. I stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it. My hands trembled more than I expected. Inside were 4 handwritten pages folded carefully together. The first line alone nearly broke me. "Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I was right about what would happen." I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, she knew me well enough to understand I'd need a minute before continuing. I kept reading. "First things first. The house, the land, and the savings are not your burden. They are not payment for suffering, and they are certainly not rewards for pain. I left them to you because you understand responsibility better than the rest of this family." Tears blurred the page for a moment. I wiped them away carefully. "You spent your whole life believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. That was never true. The right people love you because you are you." I leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside wind moved through the trees surrounding the farmhouse. Everything felt very still, very far away. Then I reached the final page. And that was the page that changed me. "Emily, do not become hard simply because others were hard to you. Bitterness is a lonely way to grow old. I have seen too much of it already. If this family breaks apart after I'm gone, let it break because of truth, not revenge. You are stronger than anger. Always remember that." I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter. Long enough for the coffee beside me to go cold. Long enough for dawn to begin lightening the windows. And somewhere during those quiet early morning hours, something inside me finally loosened. Not forgiveness exactly, but exhaustion. I was tired of carrying anger everywhere. Tired of proving my worth. Tired of needing my parents to become different people before I allowed myself peace. 3 days later, I met Margaret Holloway for lunch near the waterfront in Norfolk. The restaurant overlooked gray winter water where small boats rocked gently against the docks. Margaret ordered black coffee and tomato soup. "Your grandmother loved this place," she said while unfolding her napkin. I smiled faintly. "She loved everywhere with decent pie." Margaret laughed softly. "That too." For a while we talked about ordinary things. The Navy. Travel. Old stories about Linda during her years working in military law offices. Apparently my grandmother once embarrassed a Pentagon attorney by correcting his paperwork in front of an entire meeting. That sounded exactly like her. Then Margaret looked at me carefully. "What will you do now?" I stirred my coffee slowly. "I'm not sure yet. You could pursue additional legal action." "I know. The coercion evidence alone might have destroyed my parents financially if I pushed harder. Public embarrassment. Civil penalties? Potential fraud investigations. A younger version of me might have wanted that. Or maybe a more wounded version. But sitting there by the harbor listening to gulls outside the restaurant windows, I realized something important. I didn't actually want revenge anymore. Not real revenge. What I wanted was freedom. Freedom from resentment. Freedom from constantly reopening old wounds, hoping they'd heal differently. I looked at Margaret. "I think Grandma already won." Margaret smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "I believe she did." Over the next several weeks, I made decisions my family never expected. I sold a small, undeveloped portion of the land near the highway and used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for Navy families in eastern North Carolina. Nothing enormous, just enough to help military kids with tuition or emergency expenses. I named it the Linda Carter Family Resilience Fund. Margaret cried when I told her. Dad called twice, trying to discuss financial fairness. I didn't return the calls. Not out of cruelty. I simply understood something now. Some conversations only reopen damage. I also restored the farmhouse instead of selling it. Slowly, carefully. I repaired the porch steps, repainted the kitchen, planted new roses beside the front walkway where Grandma used to garden every spring. And for the first time in years, I slowed down enough to breathe. Military life teaches you constant movement. Schedules, deadlines, deployment clocks, always preparing for the next thing. But the farmhouse moved differently. Morning coffee on the porch, rain against tin roofing, birds settling into oak trees at dusk. Simple things, Human things. One afternoon while planting tomatoes in the backyard garden, my elderly neighbor Mrs. Donahue leaned across the fence watching me work. "You know something," she said. "What's that?" "Your grandmother didn't save you with money." I brushed dirt from my hands. "No." Mrs. Donahue smiled gently. "She saved you with love." I looked out across the property then. The garden. The porch swing. The old oak tree swaying quietly in warm Carolina wind. And suddenly I understood exactly what Grandma had really left me. Not land. Not inheritance. Not victory. Permission. Permission to stop fighting for love that should have been freely given all along. 1 year later, the farmhouse finally felt alive again. Not polished. Not perfect. Alive. The porch had fresh white paint now. New flower boxes hung beneath the front windows, overflowing with yellow daisies and red geraniums. Wind chimes Grandma once loved swayed gently in the warm Carolina breeze.